My name is Sally Marlow. Thank you very much, everyone who's come this evening. Just go through some housekeeping things first. If you could make sure, the usual, that your phone is on silent or switched off. Fire exits. If there is a fire alarm, we're not expecting a drill, so it's real, which means we all need to leave the building at the Aldwych Street entrance. So that's the one on the curve, for those of you who are not kings, on that side. And the meeting point is India Place. And you need to use the stairs. There are toilets out by the lifts, both gents and ladies, and gender neutral. Anyone know where the gender neutral loos are? Round the corner from the lifts. Okay, thank you. And we are going to be filming the talk, which is in response to a number of requests we had to film it from people who couldn't be here, who were interested in the topic. So, with that in mind, welcome. And I'm delighted to have these three guests on the panel. I should say before we start, we were expecting a fourth guest, Lindsay Hanley, and unfortunately she's not able to be with us. She has family reasons, so she's not able to join us. But we do have Paul Craddock, who is a cultural historian of medicine. His main area of expertise being the cultural history of transplant surgery. And his first book, Dragon in a Suitcase, explores transplant surgery from the 16th century to the present day and will be published by Fig Tree Penguin in 2020. Paul is also research filmmaker on the Victoria and Albert Research Institute's Encounters on the Shop Floor project, and a postdoctoral researcher working with Dr. Anna Harris at the University of Maastricht. Sam Friedman is an associate professor at LSE, where he's a sociologist of class and inequality. His research focuses in particular on the cultural dimensions of the contemporary class division, and he's recently published a book, just out in paperback shortly, called The Class Ceiling, so, which is very good, highly recommend it. He wrote that with Daniel Lorison, and that examines social mobility into Britain's higher professional and managerial occupations. The book documents how the upwardly mobile face a powerful and previously unrecognised class pay gap within Britain's elite occupations. We also have Cerisse Gunasinghe, who is a postdoctoral researcher and counselling psychologist in the Department of Psychological Medicine in the IOPPN, that's the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, for those of you who are from other parts of King's or not at King's at all. She's currently project coordinator for a research and intervention programme for young people. Her work involves consideration of health inequalities and delivering accessible interventions that meet the needs of local communities. So welcome to the panel, welcome to everybody. I want to say a bit about why we decided to have this event, and actually to be quite personal about it and tell you why it was important for me personally to champion having this event. So Paul and I know each other outside of this room, not in the biblical sense, but we were discussing the idea of class and how little it's spoken about. And for me, this feels really, really important because I am working class and I'm from Stockton-on-Tees, and I know I don't sound like that. And the reason I don't sound like that is because when I was 16, I won a scholarship to a private school, and it was a boarding school, and I got on a train in Darlington, and there were other kids there and teachers, and the teachers took me to the other kids who were already at the school and said, so this is the new girl, and they said, what's your name? And I said, oh, Sally Marlow. And they fell about laughing. And I went to the loo and I was sick. And I thought, I'm going to Somerset, I'm leaving the North East, I'm going there, I can't go back, I have to change. And when I next opened my mouth, I sounded like this. Now, don't feel bad for me, because I make radio documentaries, so I make money out of my accent. And it's still got enough northern in it. But there's so much of how we all try and fit in and pass that you and I have spoken about quite a lot. And in academia, it seems that, as with lots of other things, things get really magnified. One of the things I think which is important is to start off with, and I'm really interested to hear what the panel have got to say about this, is when we talk about class, it's not a protected characteristic in the same way that sexuality or gender identity or ethnicity is. So there aren't any sort of systems or frameworks that exist to support people who might feel that something about where they came from is something which is notable and might need something. And I'm just wondering, Sam, let's start with you as the, kind of someone who's looked at this in depth. Why do you think class isn't a protected characteristic?
Yeah, I think it's something that I feel should be, but that is incredibly complicated for the reasons that you started to sort of push upon there, which is that there's no undisputed way to measure class, and I think there's also an even more fundamentally sort of tricky element which you mentioned inadvertently in your intro there, which is that there's class origins and there's class destinations, and the whole point of social mobility is that often those are quite fundamentally different, and therefore that sort of puts a particular emphasis on how you would measure it in relation to both of those. Now I suppose most of my work or how I think it possibly should be thought about in a legal sense is trying to think about origins. Once you start with that, because I suppose in some philosophical way you're talking about a characteristic that's beyond a person's control, beyond their agency. Then when you start to think about what goes into the measurement of class origin, there's all sorts of wrinkles. I sort of take a sort of Borgesian view of social class, which is thinking about our sense of social position as a sort of an amalgamation of our forms of capital, socioeconomic and cultural, but for fairly obvious reasons. That is a very complicated task of to assemble a really effective measurement of Borgesian capitals. No organisation is biting my hand off to start introducing questions like that onto their staff surveys. So what we tend to use as the best single proxy for class is occupation, parental occupation. And so the question that I used in my research, and that is sort of the most dominant measure of class origin in sociological research, asks you basically, when you were growing up, specifically in the labour force survey when you were 14, what did the main breadwinner in your household do for a living, and then characterises that into a set of sort of occupational classes, which map onto, I think, the sorts of everyday words we tend to use: working class, middle class. So middle class occupations, we tend to think of those as sort of professional and managerial occupations. Working class are kind of routine, semi-routine occupations. I think it's a very complicated topic. I think you can always find ways to say it's too complicated to measure or it's too complicated to make a protected characteristic. I think what I'm interested in is actually sort of pushing beyond that and acknowledging the caveats, acknowledging all the complexity, but actually trying to work towards that as a goal, because I think, for the reasons that we'll perhaps get into today, it's a really powerful social issue that is not talked about enough. It has real implications for people's lives and their life chances and their career opportunities, and we're missing a trick, I think, by not bringing it into that suite of protected characteristics.
And Cerisse, what is class for you? What does that mean? Because Sam talked about the difficulties defining class and trying to find a proxy to do it. What does it mean for you?
Well, I suppose for me, I guess that I can't have this conversation without talking about other parts of my identity and other parts of my personhood, and that's being an Asian woman who's tried to navigate her way through her life course so far. So I think for me it's more about that actually to separate those things for me have been quite difficult in thinking about preparing for today. But yeah, I think for me it's mainly been around that. So there's, I suppose, that sense of otherness or outsideness that you might feel at certain parts of your life, but that's never necessarily been something that I have left position me in that place. I've always tried to get access to. So
Yeah, and you know, we haven't got Lindsay here, but one of the great things I think about her book, so if you haven't read it, she's written a really brilliant book called Respectable, and one of the great things she talks about that is about that otherness, and how otherness from origin, to use Sam's idea, but then also otherness from destination, and not fitting into either. Paul, what's your sense of what class is? What does that mean for you?
Oh God, it's always been a difficult question to think about, and I've not always thought about it, actually. It was only, in fact, when I started to work in Amsterdam and in Maastricht that I realised, that class was such a powerful thing to determine how I behaved.
In what way?
I think that colleagues in the UK, who were brought up in the UK, have a very subtle and tacit understanding of the class system, and they relate to one another according to it. Of course, other countries have their systems as well, but they can't really read me. So I get to sort of... I felt taken seriously for the first time when I was working, but I was in the States in 2011. Yeah.
And when it comes to academia, how does class play out in academia? Can anyone talk about what their personal experience has been in entering academia and how class has informed or defined that?
I'm happy to. I think the first thing to say is, in the book we do actually look at what the composition of British academia looks like in terms of class, and it's quite striking. As you would probably imagine, it's a pretty exclusive profession. About 60% of academics are from middle class, professional and managerial backgrounds. Only about 15% are from working class backgrounds. In the population as a whole, it's about 33%. So you see a pretty significant underrepresentation. My background is pretty privileged. My dad is an academic, and you'd be interested to know that if you have a parent who's an academic, you are 6 times more likely to be an academic yourself. It's even more acute actually in certain other professions. In medicine it's 24 times, which is incredible. But we talk in the book about this idea of privilege acting as a kind of following wind, sort of subtly having a kind of subtle propulsive power, and I think that chimes very strongly for me, but it's something that I think, as with a lot of privileged people, you often only realise when you make strong relationships with people who've had a very different experience, and that is the sort of dynamic force of me and Daniel, who's my co-author on the book, sort of animated the research. He's from the US, but from a working class background in the US, and a lot of our initial discussions were about our very different experiences of sort of daily occurrences and elements, particularly the sort of performative aspects of academia, staff meetings, wine and cheese sort of receptions, and
there is wine after. No cheese. No cheese.
But just to give you one very quick example of how I think this privilege has played out for me, so at LSE we now use this US academic sort of hiring system where you come to a department for an interview, but you also have individual meetings with every member of staff. 30 minutes, no agenda, no rules, no sense of really why you're meeting them. Everybody, of course, knows you're there to sort of impress them, but they go on to have pretty much like a vote on you. I was up against somebody who I knew was from a working class background, had a much stronger CV than I did, and a lot of the feedback I got was about sort of a sense of kind of fit that came from those meetings. And I've talked to him and others about like this sense of what the hell do you talk about and how do you relate in that sort of instance where there's no rules. And I think for me it was just this sense of having my entire childhood having had to sit and have incredibly dull conversations with academics around the dinner table that give you a tacit sense of what you do in that situation. And I'm almost certain that was really powerful, and that has been a gateway to an incredibly important job.
So I never had those conversations around my dinner table. In fact, dinner in our house happened at lunchtime.
We didn't have a dinner table.
Yeah.
We had a telly.
It was tough up north.
Oh, it was tough.
Paul, what about you? What's been your experience in academia?
What's been my experience in academia? Well, I'm right at the start, really. Oh, it feels like I'm right at the start. I got my PhD in 2015. Maybe that's a symptom of my upbringing. I always feel I'm right at the start of something, never actually propelling myself forward. But it feels like I'm part of a gig economy. So I have a film production company, so I make some money there. I have the contract with Penguin, so I've got a bit of an advance. I have a postdoc in Maastricht, and another contract with the NA, and it's sort of it's precarious to say the least. Precarious is the word I would sort of emphasise.
I think it's really interesting. I've never thought of an academic existence. I've never equated it with the gig economy, but that really resonates. Really resonates.
Well, I as I say, I have the business. If I didn't have that business, I could be driving a taxi or something. Just so happens I know how to make films, and people pay me for it.
And Cerisse, what about you? What's your experience been in academia? What have been some of the positives and the negatives for you?
Okay, let's maybe start with the negative ones first, maybe, I suppose for me when you talk about early experiences, the earliest thing I can remember was a careers advice session that we were all asked to go to, and I asked the lady what were my ideas at the time was to go into doing a law degree at university, and so what did I need to do to get there. And her first thing to say was, well, you're from a school in Walthamstow, you're a woman or a girl in this school, and you're Asian, so I really think that you need to think about another option. Just, have your safe bet. So I was a bit lost. I was like, I don't know what else to ask you now. Can I go away and come back? So yeah, I suppose that was my first experience of being told that academia wasn't for me. But I didn't let that stop me, because I hate it. I'm here now. Right? So I'm sitting in this chair. And that, I think, has been because I had a great opportunity to come into King's as a placement student from my university for a year, and I've been here every year since. So what's that, 17 years ago? So it made me trying to get me out of the door, but I'm refusing to go. And why? Because I've had great opportunities that I've taken by both hands, and I've had support and mentoring, one of whom is here today. So I think for me it's been about saying that actually it is possible to have a place here, and yeah, in that time applying for competitive training courses like counselling psychology or clinical psychology, for those of you who know that process. Yeah, lots of no's along the way. And actually another colleague at the time said, oh, well, you know, if I was from a working class or black and ethnic minority background, I'd have a better chance at getting on, not knowing that I was actually sitting in the room as well at the same time. And then I went away and had a look and found what were the statistics, and it was about 6% of all trainees who got a place onto the course were from black and ethnic minority groups. And I was like, well, that's not quite true then, is it, really? That's not how... There's been an assumption being made about...
An assumption about positive discrimination.
Yeah. But, yeah, like I've said, I've had opportunities that, for me, have opened doors, and yeah, you can be an academic.
There are barriers, though, aren't there? And I think that's why we're all here, and that's why people have turned up, because, and I think we need to think about what some of those barriers are. I mean, what about the sort of the messaging that is given about being working class and being in academia? Anybody got anything on that?
Something that relates to what we just said, really. In disability studies, there's a concept, I don't know if it's well known or not, but someone told me this, who was in disability studies. It's the concept of the super cripple. And this is a concept that identifies a disabled person who has made it. And I think there's something similar with working class.
What the idea that they've got superpowers?
That if someone's made it, they've got superpowers, and you'd be expected to have superpowers too, because you're disabled, because you're from an ethnic minority, because you're working class. One of your lot has made it, so you can too. I think that's an expectation that's made. That's, yeah.
So I think that's, it makes me think of, I am a child of Thatcher's Britain, and it makes me think of Norman Tebbett's On Your Bike, the idea that everybody should just get on their bike, and what about practical barriers, though? That I think there is something about the messaging. I would say that alongside what you're talking about, which I think is, a really interesting way of looking at it, there is all the messaging. For me, one of the big things is about accents, because of course I changed mine, and there's a big part of me that wishes that I hadn't done that. I have got colleagues who've been told they don't sound like other people in the department. I've got a colleague who was told not to present her first paper at a conference because they wanted the paper to do well, and they thought that her Kent accent would undermine the ability of the paper to do well. So on that messaging, what other things have people come across, either personally or in the case of Sam in your research?
I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the book we do a bunch of occupational case studies. We don't look at academia. I nearly did it at the LSE and then thought it would be a bit too close to the bone to do.
Biting the hand that feeds you?
Exactly, yeah. Although, I think hopefully, I think what we'll see from the sort of issues coming out tonight is that there's a whole bunch of things that need to be looked at within academia. But I think one of the things that came out from the book, which I think looks different in different occupations, but it's a similar sort of mechanism, are that there are these sorts of behavioural codes in different elite occupations. They're behavioural codes that often are fairly arbitrary, and they tend to reflect the kind of historical legacy of who traditionally has done that type of work, and how over time they've been able to embed, even institutionalise in some cases, their own ideas about the right way to be in the workplace, the right way to act, the right way to kind of present oneself. And I think in academia they're really powerful, that sort of performative aspect, the performance of intellect, and that there are these sort of elements of sort of the baggage of class that are misrecognised as part of that as being markers of merit. So accent would be a clear one, you know, that there's still I think a pretty robust myth that speaking with RP is a sign that you're more intelligent, but that's just, I mean, there's just absolutely no basis for that, but I think it's still fairly powerful in terms of people's perceptions. I think there's also something about even just the sort of way of talking about ideas, and the sort of language and sort of use of language that I think is also fairly classed. So I mean, again, it's one of those things where you know, it would be nice to go in and really try and forensically look at what the behavioural code is in academia, because, you know, it's very different from, you know, in accountancy we talk about this idea of corporate polish. In television we talk about this idea of studied informality. So it's quite different, but all tilt towards the privileged in various ways. And I think in academia it would be the same. It would be interesting to hear people's views on maybe some of the elements they think make up that sort of behavioural code in academia and how it relates to class, but I'm pretty sure it's there.
Yeah, and we're going to have a chance for discussion at the end, so I'll come back to that. Money, though, I'd like to talk about money. And Cerisse, you've published on debt, haven't you? So when I when I first went to university, when I was 18, it was all paid for. But now that system, and for very many years now, that system is different. And I apologise to everyone because I know it was my generation that took it away from your generation, which I am mortified about. But these money, for people who want to enter academia, to do a degree, how does money feed in? Cerisse?
I think, well, when we're talking to young people now, we have to have a real conversation about fees being 3-4 times as much as even when I was at university. So actually they're going to leave doing their first degree with almost £30,000 worth of debt.
Assuming they can live at home.
Assuming they can live at home. And then if at home, a decision to either go to university or to get into work and help contribute to your home life or help support your family is a decision that a young person is trying to negotiate. Well, that's a huge thing for someone to have to think about and consider.
There's something as well for me about, and this is part of the northern working class heritage, in fact part of my northern working class heritage, that debt is not something that you ever take on.
No.
You know, it feels, and I just wonder how that plays out in working class families, the idea of having to borrow these huge amounts of money, not just the amount itself, but the you know, the whole idea that you would borrow huge amounts of money. Does that resonate with anyone else, or is that just...
Yeah. I think for me, though, I think I was brought up with my grandparents, and I sort of just went ahead and, you know, went along this career track. They didn't really know what I was doing, so they didn't have anything to say about me borrowing vast sums of money. So I sort of sidestepped that, but I get the debt sort of aversion, definitely. Oh, Sam's his
Yeah.
finger up.
Yeah, I think I think it also plays out this idea of the sort of structuring power of having money behind you actually way further. We were sort of finding this in particularly the sort of culture and creative industries that we were looking at, and I think it's telling that you use the word gig economy to think about sort of contemporary, particularly early career academia, because I think so there's of course there's the element first of all of like the deferred gratification of a PhD, the fact that even with funding it's not a hugely secure amount of money, particularly if you're trying to do it in this city, and then you've got this element of if you have this sort of insulation of the bank of mum and dad in the background, how does that sort of impact all sorts of ways you might navigate the gig economy element of that early career academia? What extra risks are you able to take that beef up your CV? I think what we were finding in some of the other industries, and I'm not sure how this would play out in academia, is often people from working class backgrounds would say to us, well, I dreamt of going into television to become a producer or director, but actually because of the financial uncertainty, I've sort of sorted begrudgingly onto these more secure but less lucrative or less prestigious tracks within that industry. Or perhaps in academia that's taking the first lectureship or whatever, perhaps not shopping around or having that luxury of financial insulation that then informs these decisions. And it's often, I think, that we don't really know about the power of the bank of mum and dad because it's constantly being concealed and muted. It's not really socially acceptable to ask people about how their lives have been bankrolled, but in anonymous interviews you can, and you find out a huge amount. So I think it's a big factor in all of this.
And do we think that are there particular areas of academia where, or types of institutions where some of these issues are more difficult than others? So, for example, when you just said your first lectureship, and I'm thinking, first lectureship, any lecture, there aren't lectureships at the Institute of Psychiatry, at Psychology and Neuroscience at the moment. Maybe that will change, but even that feels like the experience of most early career researchers, certainly at the Institute, where Cerisse and I are based, is short-term, hopefully rolling contracts, and that's how it works. Are there some areas of academia where it might be a bit easier or more difficult? Does anyone have any?
I was quite shocked to find upon finishing my PhD, I got a scholarship, but it was a small one, still had to do work, etc., etc., etc. I was shocked at the amount of free work still to do. This is in the humanities. I don't know. I think it's a bit different in the sciences where you can get these lab positions and whatnot. But in order to get a postdoctoral position, I really had to have a book contract. I really had to have a couple of articles sole authored, written after my PhD. I had to have an array of outreach examples, these engagement events you have to do. It's just one thing after another that you're expected to do for free. So I don't know about your fields, but the humanities certainly feels like you really do need that cushion that you were talking about, and you need it for quite a few months, possibly even years after you finish your PhD.
I mean, I needed a cushion to do what I do, for sure. And I had a cushion because I'd had a previous life where I'd had a a series of proper jobs
Yeah.
and a partner, and that was my cushion.
And if I hadn't had a company that earned me much more than I would have been making in a taxi driving job or something, I would not have been able to get a postdoc.
I think we've covered lots of the problems and the barriers that exist. I'd really like to move now and start thinking about what sorts of things can help. And, I'm going to break again the rules of a chair in that I'm not impartial on this. So I think that role models and mentors are fantastic, but they can only go so far, and we need stuff which is more systemic. But I don't know that I can articulate what that is. There's your starter for 10, as they say on University Challenge or UC. It's University Challenge, isn't it? Starter for 10. Is it? I don't know. I don't know what it is. Starter for 10. Anyway, anybody.
Well, I guess for me, I did do the asking. So where you don't have family members or friends who can show you what your career could look like, or where you could end up if you go to university and have a postdoc. I had to ask what might be next for me, and so by doing that, I think then I was able to then pursue that next step for me, and has enabled me to actually now do the work back in the school that I grew up in, to be able to say that King's is a place for you. Mm-hmm. So just today I rushed in very late because I was in Walthamstow as part of our research methods in schools education programme, and actually helping those young people see that academia is a place for them, and Russell Group Universities is a place for them, and helping them see from early that actually these things are achievable, and help them have the information that they need to move forward.
And King's does do some of that stuff, and does it quite well, I think. The initiatives that you work on, but there are other initiatives. But once you're actually in academia, what helps? What could help then? What would make a difference?
Well, I think that there's there's a huge emphasis and real developed work on sort of widening participation, but it's quite interesting how little emphasis there is on getting people from working class backgrounds into the profession and on within the profession. I was just saying before we started, but off the back of the book, I've sort of been working with various organisations in various sectors, and what I've been struck by is how far behind academia is on just really even thinking from the basic stuff around this issue. For example, just measurement. I don't know if anybody is in a university where they are asked questions about their class backgrounds, but from what I understand, it's not going on in very many places, certainly not in my institution. And the reason why that sort of basic information is important is that you get a sense, of what your institution looks like. It's also really important because it connects with other diversity characteristics for us to be able to see intersectionality so importantly. So, we show very clearly in the book that there's a clear double disadvantage in academia if you're a woman from a working class background, and if you are, black and minority ethnic and from a working class background. Really powerful double disadvantage in terms of earnings. and you can probably see if you're most universities do collect that information on other diversity characteristics and look at, to some extent, progression. But if you connect class as well, you can really see, I think, those things play out. And I think that's really important as I started just really getting to grips with this idea of measurement and then intersectionality. I think some of the other ideas, in a way, are a little bit more challenging about, I suppose, sort of trying to get a conversation going about what talent or merit really looks like, and sort of what the function of these more performative, self-presentational aspects are in academia, and how we can sort of challenge them and stamp them out a little bit in order to make people feel like they don't need to change their accent, they don't need to use a whole set of sort of jargon in a particular way that is just a sort of, sort of a sort of signal that they're trying to fit in.
So there's something here about going back to that very first issue that we started talking about defining class and perhaps even making it a protected characteristic, if that is a thing that would get it defined and would get it measured. And at the moment it's not. So there's something about not understanding what the landscape is in academia. Cerisse, you're nodding. Do you think that's... I mean, I'm asking you not as, not with your science hat on, but does that instinctively, intuitively feel like a...
I think for me, it's not been my experience that that's kind of has played that role. So I think for me, what I've done is I've brought my ideas to the table. I've gone and spoken, to, I guess maybe what it does for me is it has enabled me to be heard. And so actually, my accent, lots of I talk very East London most days. And it means that I talk to people in corridors and I say, I've had this idea, and working with people who say, yes, you can do that. Do this first, but you can do that. So I don't know, protected characteristic. I don't know.
No, I don't know what the answer is.
There's an interesting conversation I had with Professor Geraldine Van Buren at Queen Mary, who's a lawyer. And she was one of the people who drafted the the United Nations Conventions of Rights of the Child. I think I've got that right. But she said that one of the most difficult parts of writing that document was to define what a child was, because it depended on where you were from. Some people consider a child to be an adult to be someone who can pick up a spade and work. That's when you sort of exit childhood. So a child has a different meaning for each, not for each, but for, depending on your cultural background. And she doesn't think it's particularly a problem that we can't define working class in such specific terms. I don't know what I feel. I'm still sort of working that out. But I also don't think it's very easy to define gender or sexuality. I wouldn't know how to define that.
So I think you're right about it's difficult. I'm not going to go down the gender and sexuality route. But I think it is really difficult to define what class is, and I think so much of it is about how you identify. But coming back to something that Sam said early on in the discussion, it's difficult, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't try and do it. Cerisse, you just said something which I think was really interesting about it being part of who you are, that you would stop people in the corridor and talk to them. What are the positives about being a working class academic, but perhaps that's not how you define. what are the positives about what has your background given you that makes you a better academic, or a thing that drives you or pushes you forwards?
I suppose, yeah. I suppose that's having the a kind of an additional perspective, and then actually thinking about, well, how does what we do impact, or how do we make it real for the real person
In terms of your research?
Yeah, or even just any of the bits of work that I'm involved in, because actually it has to to me it has to be meaningful, and for there to be some, I suppose that comes with my training as well as a psychologist. We do strive for the wellness of people, so I always do come at my work from that place. But yeah, I think for what it's given me an opportunity to have conversations with, people that I read in textbooks when I was growing up, people that I'm seeing around me, have faced their own struggles and their own barriers, but still are thriving. So I think it's just given me a space to bring that humanness, and that Essex and East Londonness into a place where it's wine and cheese.
Mm.
Well, for me, one of the things that I think my background has given me, which is positive, is that I'm quite straight talking and quite frank, as anybody who's worked anybody who's worked with me would know. And I think that part of that has come from where I've come from, and I see that very much as a positive that helps me do better work. What about you? Is there anything for you?
Come back to me with positive.
Okay. And Sam, you're a bit of a pretender, so we can't ask you that question, can we?
No, I mean, the only thing some of you might know Lisa Mackenzie, who is very much sort of presents herself as a working class academic, very proud to be so, and she was in my department at the LSE for a couple of years, and she was an unbelievably refreshing antidote to a lot of the performative sort of middle class posturing, the sort of bizarre over intellectualisation of fairly mundane aspects of university admin, that where you add half an hour onto a meeting for no reason whatsoever, and just for calling things out. Maybe that's the plain talking element, but it's also this element of teaching, right? I mean, you were saying about going out and out. I mean, Lisa was just unbelievably powerful as somebody who was able to resonate with students and teach in a way that made lots of students that probably find the LSE horribly alienating place somewhere that they felt was for them. So
she's gone to Durham now, hasn't she?
Yeah, she has. But yeah, so I think there's also one other interesting thing that comes out actually in the social psychological literature, and I've seen a little bit in interviews, which is that there's often a more interdependent ethos among people from working class backgrounds, and a slight discomfort with using networks for their own individualistic gain, which I think is interesting. And I think it's not so much a sort of malevolent thing of people from privileged backgrounds being plotting, but I think what I've noticed is that there's more sort of inherent comfort among those from privileged backgrounds to kind of use their networks to sort of negotiate opportunities, and that is not necessarily, of course it's not presented as such, but it basically functions as such. And I think that I think we could take a step back and say that a more interdependent approach to academic practice is a good thing.
So that's interesting, because since I've sort of stuck my head above the parapet and said this is who I am and I think that this is important, I've made lots of new relationships from people who would also identify as working class.
A lot of people use the term "come out" as working class, don't they?
Yeah.
Certainly feels like it.
Yeah. And you founded the Association of Working Class Academics,
Well, I
didn't
didn't
you?
personally found
Not personally.
it.
You were one of the interdependent networks.
Yes, I wrote, along with a few other working class academics, a contribution to the Times Higher Education last year, and it was about experience of being a working class academic. Although I'm not sure I want to identify as that, really, but I'll go with it for now. And we grouped together, and over the next few months founded an Association of Working Class Academics. If you Google Association of Working Class Academics, you'll get the first version of the website, and you can join it for free, and it's got lots of different... We're still working out what it's for, but amongst other things, it's a sort of kind of a support network, and you should join it, whether you're working class or not.
And that feels like a good point at which to be inclusive and open the floor up and say, has anybody got anything any questions or anything that they'd like to raise with any of the panel? Here we go.
Thank you. I wanted to start by saying that I started when I sat down by tweeting, and I said, looking forward to this, really am. And I'm not sure I quite realised how much I was looking forward to it until I heard you all. And I said, I sit on many gender panels, but I feel like an imposter because of my class, not my gender. And although I love supporting my gender and I love supporting our early career researchers and our students, I think all of you have just vocalised how I feel about myself, my career, and it really resonates, and it is just such a relief that somebody has finally done this. So for that, can I thank you? I wanted to just pick up on a couple of things that you were asking, in particular about obstacles. Financial, absolutely, of course it's an obstacle. I can't even get my head around how much easier it is for privileged families to put their children through tutoring and training and introducing them to the academics who will give them the summer placements, and it just makes such a huge difference. But actually for me, I think one thing that only became clear to me as I got more senior, so I'm a professor, so I'm a working class, what did you call them? A super academic, super working class. So, you know, I can't deny I've done all right for a working class lass. But actually, what the real obstacles are so much more subtle. And some people have been tweeting this, saying I felt like, you know, I felt embarrassed I didn't know how to ski when I went to a conference. I personally, I'm a single mother, have been for many years, so I feel like a failure because I can't bring my husband or my partner or whatever, so I never get invited to dinner parties. And it's those much more subtle things, and I find the higher you get, the worse that becomes. And I, for the first time in my career ever, felt as if I'd hit a ceiling. I didn't know which ceiling I'd hit, but I think now you've maybe named it for me and I hadn't even thought about it. But I did want to add to the positives, and then I'll shut up and you can move on. I completely agree. I think that people who come from our backgrounds, we're proud, working class pride. God, it gets us into a lot of trouble. But it makes us completely straightforward, more approachable, and it makes us, I believe, better able to support those around us. I don't care if you're working class or not, but if you're an early career researcher, whatever protective characteristic you've got, I think we're damn good at making you feel more comfortable, and for that, I think we should all be proud.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your brilliant presentation. I suppose the question I wanted to ask really is, does this even matter, right? So I know people that went to public school, went to elite universities, who end up washing dishes for a living, right? I know people that didn't finish high school education that are living in £1 million houses, right? So the reality is we're setting people up for a career in academia where the outcome is not as certain as it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. So you're talking about this precarious lifestyle. So should we be really pushing like our working class kids into this precarious lifestyle? Should we not be giving them more certainty to get into like maybe, you know, digital technology and run their own businesses? So does this even matter?
Ooh, controversial. Yeah, we've got someone who wants to answer that.
Just to answer your point, really, I think it absolutely matters. You know, the purpose of universities is to define and influence society. If you've got one type of voice doing that, what kind of, you know, society are we creating and shaping? You cannot have a lack of diversity in research, in teaching, you know, in developing young people's perspectives. It's not just about the career, it's about the influence that this role carries.
But it should be about like whether to put in that food on the table and paying your bills, right? And if you're, because most early career academics that I know doing PhDs, they live a precarious lifestyle. They can't even pay their rent, right? So why are we pushing kids into that sort of direction when they
So I would say there's another question. So, you know, for the camera, because it may not have picked you up, you're basically saying that to put food on the table, that's the priority, and so why should we be pushing our kids into academia? I think academia is not functioning properly, and that's not just a class thing. So the people who are surviving in academia are the people with bank of mum and dad. But that doesn't mean that we should all just give up on academia. I think that we all have a responsibility for the reasons that you state. Our academic institutions cannot look one way. The thought that shapes our society cannot be one type of thought. And, you know, wherever thus that the people at the bottom don't get to make the big decisions. And I think that there's something really, really important about making sure that people do rise up and make those decisions. Come the revolution, I hope you're with us. We've got another one over there.
Thank you, everyone. I'm a big fan of the class ceiling, as all my friends know, because I'm telling everyone, read this book. And what I think is very important, that although obviously to post-colonial, decolonial theories, and also feminist and queer theories, we all knew what you have written there. From lived experiences, but it's all in one book, and that's great. What we see is actually a structure that is systemically racist, classist, and sexist. Therefore, needs to be changed. And what is my big question about that is like, I'm identified as someone, as a migrant that comes from a upper working class, lower middle class. I don't know. I don't translate well here, so I don't know. But not from a privileged background. And now I work in the cultural sector as a curator. My sister, the same. She's in academia. So at this point, I have to identify as a middle class. I think that when we arrive in an elite job, we have to, with all the struggle that we have to recognize our privileges that we have at this point as a white people. So I feel like as white people, they have some privileges. Which strategy do you do within academia to open up to people that don't have those privileges? Because that means that you are the problem in some way, you know? I am the problem, although my background is a working class. Because as you said, the more marginalized characteristics you have, actually, the kind of salary, that you have is, the discrimination that you have is multiplied. Therefore, my question is, now that you are in this position as professor, you know, what are you doing actively to make sure that you don't hire or, you know, work or live with people that looks like you, following the how do you call it? Homophilia is the
Homophilia, yeah.
Yeah, homophilia. So sorry, that's long, but I think it's time to act and just say, now we have this position, what we can do to change.
Yeah, I think this is I think it's a really important question. For myself, I can only answer it that I've got a personal code, but I think the much more interesting question is the structural one. And that's the bit that I struggle with. Structurally, what can we be doing? And the intersectionality, I think, is really important as well. And Cerisse, you and I talked about this event before coming here, and how important it is to stress that. And by being here and talking about class, there isn't any negation of any other characteristic, and there is recognition, I think. And as Sarah was saying, you know, we can be champions. We can be the ones who shout because we've already had to do it to get to where we are. So we can do more of it. But structurally, I don't know.
Just a quick last comment is what I think that in some way, intersectionality studies have been showing that class is not divided by race. Therefore, that needs to be, tackled together in terms of, trying not to marginalize people. But what I'm thinking is that there are people already working in university with decolonial movements. They're very, very active in creating codes to make sure that actually the management of universities is not only white, middle class. So maybe those people should be invited into the tables to rethink the university.
But I think there's a step before, and the step before is that we haven't defined class, and it's not recognised as a protected characteristic yet. For me, that matters. I mean, I know not everybody in the panel thinks like that, but for me, that matters.
Just picking up on that, I was just wanted to say that also as researchers, we need to have in mind when this reference to complexity, what role does it play? Because it's very easy to say that something is too complex to be analyzed. But then it happens to be, it's complex to define class, especially middle and upper class. It's complex to define the structure that are in powers, where it's quite easy to define working class, which is by definition populated by more people than the other classes. So it's more diverse, there are more stories, there are more unique people there, but then it's very easy to say working class as well. In terms of race, it's very easy to define people coming from Africa as just very similar, but when we talk about Europeans, then, I mean, we are very, very different, even though we are 400 million people living in a very small part of the world. So I think also as a researcher, we need to make aware of which are the limits to our methodology that just enforce these differences and how they play in the hand of powers and the status quo.
Yep.
Just to respond to the question about what you do personally. I mean, I think it's a really key issue. I sort of think of it in the sort of 3 levels in a way. I mean, I think for me, and a bit like you're saying, Sally, I see after having done this research, the importance of the systemic change, and to me that's top down, that's government. For me, that's partly about this idea of class as a protected characteristic. There's also trying to think about the idea we've developed around a class pay gap and getting that possibly as something that large organisations are mandated to report in the same way as the gender pay gap. I don't see that it's not a panacea at all, but I think those sort of large scale top-down governmental changes are important to push for. I sit now on this Social Mobility Commission. In a way, is a way of trying to have a hand in those things and not just sit in the ivory tower and do a nice critique and then come back and sit nicely at LSE. And it's messy and it's really tough because it's very political, and the other commissioners come from very different places in terms of this debate, and I'm sure many of you are aware, but I mean, social mobility is a political football, and there are lots of voices on the centre right who have got who like to use it and have a very different view of what systemic change is in these type. I think there's the sort of meso level, which is the sort of organisational change we've been talking about, and for universities I think that means individual institutions and trying to push your institutions, and I think that's, we can all play a role. I think the sort of more personal individual stuff is also really important, but I'm aware of, in my case, the limits of your own positionality in that regard. So I can say I can try and support working class students that I meet, but there are limits to how I'm going to resonate for them, and so I sort of feel like part of what I can do is try to fight for the fact that people that don't look like me should be in the academy, and then they can have a role in changing the perception of the academy in ways that I can't. But I definitely agree. Like there's it's something that I think about all the time. That you often, I think you can sort of write something and then just say, okay, I've done my role. Yeah.
We've got time, I think, for one more question. Anybody? Yeah.
Oh,
Go for it. He had the mic.
I think you emphasised a lot on the idea that class hasn't been defined enough and it's not a protected characteristic in order to start having a society-wide conversation. But don't you think that it would be important, because as Sam just emphasised, being aware himself as a person of not working class background of the class division and difficulty of social mobility, I think the issue that I encounter frequently is the fact that my middle class or upper class colleagues and course mates aren't aware of social mobility and aren't aware of the differences, and make various assumptions, such as assumptions about something like you do know how to ski, or you spent your summers traveling to the other part of the world, or perhaps that for you being able to afford something means the same to them, because that's also something that I find a lot when someone of a different class background brings up what they can't afford, they don't necessarily mean the same thing as me. So do you think we are ready to start having this conversation even without having protected characteristics and having defined class, is my question.
We're here starting.
Yeah, we are. But I think that perhaps what you're getting at is that if I've understood you, is that for things to change, certain people do have to acknowledge their privilege and perhaps give a little bit of that privilege up. And that's what makes these things so entrenched, I think. Whether you're talking about class or whether you're talking about sexuality, whether you're talking about ethnicity, change always requires the people who've done actually rather well out of a system to just step back a little bit. And I think, I don't know, I think that people don't tend to want to do that.
So we have to make.
Yeah. So I know I said one more question, but the very first person to arrive was this chap here, this gentleman here, and I think we should give him the last word because he was the first in.
Well,
first in, last
I'm in a
in.
very privileged situation.
There you go.
I actually had a number of points and things to raise. I think in terms of priority, I think it's wonderful to have this discussion, have this meeting. I think I'd be very interested to know what the Association of Working Class Academics are thinking of doing in terms of programmes, events, their purpose and so on. I think that would be really important to keep it going and to develop it. I think my colleague's comment over there was provocative and interesting. I think the simple answer is for working class people, and I can talk a lot about definitions, but for working class people, we should have no sacred cows, and that's why we need to be in academia. It's the same in society as a whole. There's no place we can't go, and I think that's why we want to encourage more working class academics or whatever. I think the final point, probably, which I think is really important, is probably the word widening participation. And I think if we are from a working class background, we should look at widening participation for students. And I know there's been quite a bit of work done on that, but I think we should do more. But we should also do it for academics. It's the same issue. And I think that's where we can make a difference. And then finally, being working class, what difference does it make? And I think we're all academics, so we need to think of it in terms of the classroom and students and so on. And it's a very difficult one, and it's a complex one, but I think probably the one word that would describe it is, I think if you're from a working class background, you're more empathetic with your students. You know where they're coming from. You know what disadvantage means. So you know when they're not understanding or they're nervous or whatever. You can somehow, you know what that feels like. And then you know how to overcome those barriers for them. So I think, you know, we're discussing it, but there is a way of discussing it in terms of our students. And I'll finally finish. Yeah, I'll tell you now, I'll give you the secret, I'm a lawyer, so you've got to shut me up. And the final thing was, how does it make a difference in the classroom to my students? And it's interesting, I teach advocacy, I'm more of a professional skills tutor than an academic, and I teach advocacy. And the number of students who come into class and they want to have a barristerial voice, whatever that is, what it actually means is an upper class or middle class voice. And they stumble over sentence construction and how to say things. But when you say to them, just be yourself, just talk in a natural way, and the penny drops, and they know exactly how to speak and how to be effective advocates. And it's got nothing to do with accents whatsoever, which is why, but they spend all their time trying to drop their, mostly working class accents, to become this kind of very upper class, Jacob Rees-Mogg kind of accent. And it doesn't help them. It doesn't help their teaching, doesn't help their learning. So, yeah, I went on too long. Thank you.
Thank you. Selfishly, I've really enjoyed the discussion and I've got loads out of it, and I hope that you guys have too. So thank you very much.